you to you all. We now move on to the fourth and final session on the subject of platform regulation, balancing fairness, contestability with innovation, and will the DMA promote innovation? And I'd like to welcome Dr. George Hoopis, Director of Frontier Economics, and as moderator of this session, and also sponsor of the IIC's Brussels TMF. Thank you, George. Over to you.
Thank you, Lynn. Good afternoon, everyone. And welcome to this, what I think is the last session of the day today on thinking about the regulation of digital platforms and innovation. I have not joined all the earlier meetings. I will start with expressing a hope that this is the last time that we meet virtually. Not that I'm getting a bit tired with Zoom and Teams meetings, but I think it would be good to start seeing people face to face again. So I would really hope next year we have an opportunity to meet from close. Now, I think the theme for this session today, I think, is quite timely because, as I suspect a number of you would know, the European Commission has now agreed a text for the Digital Markets Act, and we will now move from the kind of design phase, if you can call it that, to the implementation phase. And the aim of the panel session today is exactly to focus very much on that, trying to think what are the challenges that will come with the implementation of the DMA, but in particular thinking about one dimension which I think is particularly is very important, which is to do with innovation. Now, I think there is broad agreement that the digital services have delivered significant innovation to the consumers in Europe and throughout the world. And indeed, the first sentence of the Digital Markets Act, it starts by recognizing that the digital services have brought important innovative benefits for users. And I would say that's true for both kind of the largest platforms, the gatekeepers are going to be regulated, and also all the other players in the digital services supply chain. Now, one of the proposals that the Parliament made was that to link the objectives of the DMA, which are to achieve or improve fairness and contestability, these are the key twin objectives, with innovation. So the Parliament established, if you want, more of a link between the fairness and contestability objective and the innovation objective. And I think that raises a number of interesting issues in terms of how do we think about innovation with digital platforms. I think the first one would imagine is the obvious one, which is that by reducing the power of the large platforms, large gatekeepers, it will provide an opportunity for other players in the digital supply chain to innovate and innovate more. So, for example, one of the proposals, one of the obligations relates to reducing self-preferencing or removing self-preferencing, which should open the opportunity for other people in the supply chain to offer their services instead of the gatekeepers' related services. Now, one question, however, that also arises here is that some of the other provisions of the DMA relate to providing open and equal access to the services of the systems of the the gatekeepers. And that in itself could remove one other dimension in which people can differentiate, which is to innovate, which is to do differentiation. And we have some experience from this from telecoms, where when you have access to the SMP operators' telecoms networks, then the ability that you have to differentiate will always be influenced by the fact that you have access to the same wholesale service from the telecoms companies. The second dimension of innovation is innovation by the gatekeepers themselves. And I think here there is a balance between providing the incentive for gatekeepers to continue to innovate, but at the same time not to use that in a way which reduces the ability of others to innovate and indeed makes it more difficult for rivals to compete with them. I think one interesting dimension here of innovation is that some of the gatekeepers that will be regulated in some core platform services are also challengers, if you want, in other core platform services. So something like Microsoft, who would be expected to be a gatekeeper in terms of operating systems, also has a search engine called Bing, which could be a challenger to Google. So one question here is, are there issues in terms of how the DMA is implemented in terms of ensuring that that sort of innovation, to the extent that is beneficial for consumers, could actually be encouraged. And here again, we have examples in the telecoms industry where this has happened. Fixed telecoms operators getting into content by buying sports rights, etc., in order to compete with pay TV providers. Another dimension which has been discussed quite a bit is this question of what sometimes is called disruptive innovation versus incremental innovation. The idea being that when it's kind of linked with this competition for the market, that you can innovate big time and take over the market versus more incrementally. And I'm old enough not just to remember Nokia as the largest handset manufacturer, which then got replaced by Apple, but actually I'm old enough to have used the Nokia television. And they were pretty big on television because they moved before they moved on to mobile phones. Now, I think the argument here is that there are so much returns that the big gatekeepers have already made, that should provide quite significant incentives for other people to enter and try and compete for the market. And even if there is a prospect that if other people eventually become gatekeepers, they could face regulation, that's kind of quite a remote possibility, and therefore that should not really affect potential incentives of others to compete strongly in the core platform service of the gatekeepers. I think this is understood, and I think it's a clear point. One of the points to make, however, is that some of the companies that compete in what I would call sectors that are adjacent to the gatekeeper sectors, and we have one of them in the panel today, also are large companies. So when you think about taking on somebody like Meta or Google or others, then I think that would likely require significant investment and significantly deep pockets. And so there is, to my mind, still potentially a question of whether the prospect of being regulated in some way might potentially have an impact on the incentives of those players to challenge the gatekeepers. And then finally, there's a question of what I would call unintended consequences. I think the EU has taken a line with the DMA, which is a bit different from the UK line. In the EU, it's much more prescriptive, the DMA. There's a set of obligations, Article 5, which have to be adopted and implemented by all the gatekeepers. There's a set of obligations in Article 6 where there is a little bit more room for discussion. But in general, the proposals are quite prescriptive. In the UK, the approach is a bit different, and the idea is to develop something which is more tailored to the individual. It's called company with strategic market status, the gatekeeper equivalent, and then there is more room to develop something which is specifically targeted at the issues identified. So one question is, in the implementation phase, as this obligation come into play, will there be room for designing them and implementing them in a way which kind of minimize the risk of what I would call unintended consequences? So that's all I was going to say in terms of introduction, just to set a little bit the scene. And I think we have really an excellent panel today to discuss some of these issues across the range of the different skills that one could wish for. We have Professor Tommaso Valletti. He's professor of economics at Imperial College. He's the ex-chief economist of the European Commission, has been involved with facing Google from the Commission side in the Android case. And he's also a member of the panel of economic experts, which was established by the European Commission Joint Research Center, and has written a report on the main economic aspects of the DMA. We then also have Dr. Alexander de Streel. He's a professor of EU law and member of SER, and has been also very involved with the development of the DMA, including in relation to the institutional design, and has written a number of papers on DMA topics. And then we move away from kind of the design or the experts of the DMA to the people that would have to deal with it. So we have Daniel Friedlander from Sky. He's the head of the EU office and the European Affairs Director for Sky. And I think Sky would be seen as a sort of challenger, if I can use that term, that the DMA is potentially targeting to give companies like Sky an opportunity to become more active in this area. And so I think it would be very interesting to hear from him how his initial views on the kind of the positives and possibly the concerns that the DMA brings. And then last but not least, we have Jeremy Godfrey, who's the chair of the Competition and Consumer Protection Commission of Ireland and an ex-regulator of the telecom sector. And I think he can bring all his very valuable experience in terms of dealing with incumbent operators over a long period of time to bear in relation to the implementation challenges in particular of the DMA and his views on around whether the Commission is well equipped to deal with what's coming and the role of national regulators. So that's all I was going to say in terms of introduction. I think we expect people to make a relatively between 5 and 10-minute presentations. I think if you have any questions, please add them to the chat box, and then I will pick them up. And without further ado, let me hand over to Tommaso for his observations.
Thank you very much. Thank you, George. It's so you gave a very nice wide introduction. I want to be very simple. I'll bring the opinion of an economist. I think the DMA is a very good thing. Of course, we will see implementation, there will be mistakes and unintended consequences, but the alternative or not doing anything is something that Europe cannot bear to have any longer. We are here with this legislative initiative for a couple of reasons. The reasons are well understood now. One reason is that an ex-post intervention via antitrust has failed. So antitrust has failed in many sectors of our economy, but in particular with big tech, and we realize it comes too late, too little, too long. So it doesn't work. So even the antitrust community itself, to which I belong, has realized that we cannot do it. And secondly, there are economic characteristics that, for an audience like today's audience, made of people which are expert in telecommunications, you will understand it's quite clearly a situation where there are economies of scale, network effects, and then you add also behavioral issues of the way consumers behave, huge investments, and this is a situation where you don't expect the market to work well. Okay? So something that we thought would happen was this competition for the market that George has alluded to, but in core sectors of the digital economy, that has remained a theoretical proposition. So we haven't had any entry in, core sectors such as search or social networks, or I mean, I can go on, but Google has 95% of searches in Europe for the past 15 years. So even if you're waiting for some entry at some stage, this is going to be definitely too late, and there is imminent harm. So if we don't do something now, we know that consumers are going to be harmed. So the economic principles are well grounded. I think also, contrary to some approaches to regulation, these interventions are not meant to do price regulation. So there is it's not that. So if you come from telecoms regulation, the regulators are not going to say the details of how much it's going to cost for this and that. It's not that. It's really a type of initiative which is trying to give competition a chance, because a competition ultimately needs competitors, and we haven't had many of those competitors. And perhaps also it's interesting to see that it's trying to give a chance to European competitors, which is good. So our enforcers respond to a constituency. So the current system, of course, there is some innovation happening, but we are not asking to, destroy the big tech. That's not, we are just trying to improve the currency situation. But the current system, if you think about it, could have European companies that at best, this is the best case scenario, if they innovate and they're successful, they are going to be bought up by Google, by Facebook. And so they become part of their system. So you have a very profitable entrepreneur, which is great for the individuals, but does it contribute to making Europe a better place? No, it just reinforces the ecosystem of the incumbent firms of Google and Facebook, and that's about it. Instead, the current systems, through fairness and the contestability, which is a set of regulations which are well understood in telecoms, interoperability, interconnection, etc., the European startup or the medium-sized firm, or even the large firm, but it's not as large as the current incumbents. We shouldn't forget that the market capitalization of the GAFAM now is $10 trillion. I mean, the order of magnitude is very, very large. So these companies will stand a chance of surviving, okay? Because you don't need to be bought. If you are interconnected, let's give an example. Many of you have for sure an instant messaging app. Some of you might have tried to download Signal. perhaps because you heard that there were problems with WhatsApp, you don't want to be followed by the Facebook ecosystem in everything you do. So perhaps you did download the Signal, but did you manage to use Signal? And the answer is perhaps you convince a friend of yours, you have a couple of communication now and then, but certainly you didn't manage to convince all your friends or your family, your mother, your parents, and your chat groups, and this is lost. Why? Because currently, if you are on Signal to communicate with another person using Signal, you need that person also to be on a Signal. With the new system, instead, if you have a Signal is just an example, of course, you will be able to communicate with somebody on WhatsApp, which makes the contestability aspect a real prospect. And this is what we're hoping for, of course. We're hoping for. So we're not breaking up WhatsApp from Facebook, but we are trying to give companies such as Signal a chance to survive and grow and bring more choice and more competition to the market. The other example that will resonate to telecoms audience is the following. A problem that we have is Apple. Apple is integrated across the vertical chain and has lots of things, which is fine. Apple, among other things, has an app store and also provides music services. Okay? So it is Apple Music. That's fine. Nobody is telling Apple they cannot do that. But the problem is that Apple is charging 30% to Spotify. So this is a situation that if Spotify uses the Apple Store, pays 30%, but Apple doesn't impute itself the same 30% when they are competing in the market for music streaming. And again, if you think about telecom, that would be a problem if an incumbent telecoms operator who owns infrastructure sets an access price which is very different from the price it imputes itself. So this is non-discrimination, which is currently is called fairness, but that's the same economic principle. It's not just about the price. The important thing is it's also about when you are shown on search results, etc. But this explains a lot of the economics and the rationale for an intervention. I will conclude by saying that the positive news is that Europe has been fast. So I was surprised by how fast Europe has been in adopting this proposal. As I said, implementation remains to be seen. It's an initiative which has a lot of counterparts with their own differences in the US, in Japan, in South Korea, but also in China. So people may want to see actually the fastest legislation and one or the most interesting one is coming from China. If people are interested, China is actually doing the same with their own big tech giants that they have, Tencent, Alibaba, etc. But they are following the same principle, and if anything, they're moving even faster than Europe. It has to be done. So we have to roll up our sleeves. Nothing is perfect. We have to learn things. The risk is to delay adoption and enforcement because these markets that move fast, as I said at the very outset of my intervention, we cannot afford to lose an attempt to bring in competition into these markets because we have seen the consequences for far too long. Back to you, George.
Thank you, Tommaso. Thank you very much. And now over, Alexander, to you to give us your view on this topic.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. So I tend to agree with what Tommaso has said. I think it's an imperfect piece of legislation, but at least it's an interesting attempt. Enforcement will be hugely difficult, and I think that's now where we have to focus our mind. But I want to just focus on one point because many people say yes, but or some people say, in particular coming from the US and coming from the big tech, the DMA will destroy innovation in Europe. And I just want to maybe focus on that issue in 3 points. My main idea is that it is not true at all. And in fact, as Tommaso has said, the idea is that the DMA should promote competition and innovation, and it can be the case. So the first point I want to make is that innovation, and Giorgio mentioned that, is not an explicit objective of the text of the DMA because the explicit objective are contestability and fairness. But clearly this is an implicit one, and why do we want, as Tommaso explained, contestability and fairness is to promote innovation. The thing is that I still think that the innovation framework behind the DMA has not maybe been sufficiently developed. I think it's there implicitly, but it has not been sufficiently developed. And I hope that during the enforcement process, this innovation framework, let's say, will be developed, and that will help to interpret the rule, because nothing is self-executing in digital, and so I don't believe that any of the 18 rules that have been agreed last week are self-executing. So they will need some interpretation, and you will need a compass to interpret those provisions, and that compass could be innovation. Now, the innovation in general happen in three ways. If I simplify, in every market, and in the digital market in particular. The first is innovation in the market, if you want. So innovation on the existing platform. So the example is Spotify or Epic or Tinder, who wants to have access to the platform, to the Apple platform, but they don't want to use their payment system because they have a better one. Okay, so that's innovation in the market or on the platform, if you want. The second type of innovation is innovation for the market that Judge mentioned, and that is really having one platform which will replace the existing platform with more or less the same services, so kind of frontal competition. But because you have network effect, you expect that this frontal competitor will take over the whole market. So the idea would be, do we have a new search engine replacing Google, or a new social network replacing Facebook? As Tommaso was mentioning, we had that at the very beginning of the digital economy, but we don't have it anymore. And I don't think that with the number of network effect, an ecosystem effect, which is in fact even stronger than the network effect, this kind of frontal competition will happen so much. And then the third type of innovation, which is probably the most interesting, is innovation not in or for the market, but innovation by changing the market. So in a way, you have a new platform, which another services, which is replacing the existing platform. So that's the diagonal competition, or what is often called disruption. Okay, so you have someone which is not frontally attacking, if you want, the existing platform, but come from the sideway and with another services, and then replace the existing platform. So we have seen that, for instance, the operating system of Microsoft, which remains still strong for PC, has been to some extent sidelined by the development of smartphone and the operating system on smartphone. And in digital, contrary to telecom, probably the most important one is disruptive innovation. And so what is very important, I mean, the three channels are important, but what is very important is that the DMA promote also this third channel. And so in finishing here, I just wanted to see and to show that the DMA is promoting those three channels of competition. So if we take the first one, competition in the market or competition on the platform, we have, for instance, the vertical interoperability obligation, so which allows the Epic, Spotify or Tinder to indeed interoperate and come with their own payment services on the Apple or Android App Store. So that will help that channel of competition. The second one, frontal competition, we have some obligation, for instance, that the search engine should share their data with a new entrant search engine, for instance, Bing or another one. So we have that, so it can help that sort of competition, although I don't believe that's the most important one. And then in terms of disruption of diagonal competition, what we have a number of obligations which are forcing the existing gatekeeper to be open. So as Tommaso was mentioning, the idea is not to break them up, but to open them. And by the way, this is exactly what has been done in telecom 30 years ago. In Europe, the idea was not to break up the telecom operators, but to open them with the open network provision program of the Commission in the 90s. So here the point is that by opening the platform, you allow the disruptor to come close enough to the existing platform to then disrupt that existing platform. So for instance, there is an obligation that the business user or marketplace should have access to their data about what they are selling. Now that business user may then transmit those data to a new marketplace, which is coming with a different type of selling, and then will be able to disrupt the existing one, in particular Amazon. So I think the DMA is pushing those 3 channels of innovation, and that is what is important. Now, George has mentioned that there is always trade-off in any public intervention, and clearly here as well you have a trade-off. And if we focus on innovation, there is a trade-off between the incentive of the gatekeeper and the incentive of the entrance, being the complementer, the frontal competitor, or the disruptor. That's very clear. And the DMA do a choice, which is again, to me, a bit too implicit, but still relatively clear, in favoring the incentive of the entrance over the incentive over the gatekeeper, because nobody denied that those gatekeepers are indeed extremely innovative, but maybe less than before, but they remain to be innovative. But the point is that we want to, the DMA and the policymaker in Europe have decided to favor, if there is a trade-off, if there is a balance to be made, the one of the entrance. And the idea behind is that the legislator thinks that will increase the level of innovation, but also, and that is very important, the diversity of innovation, because we should not only focus on the level, but also on the diversity of innovation. Now, this is a conjecture that the legislator has made. It seems to be very reasonable, but we will have to see, of course, at the end, whether it materializes itself. It is also very much into the European tradition of ordoliberalism. So I think that, in a way, the DMA may be a revolution for the big tech, but it's very much according to our European tradition of ordoliberalism. And then to finish, I think the DMA is an innovation in itself, a regulatory innovation in a way. So we will be able to assess its effect, the effect of this innovation in some times. And again, as Tommaso was mentioning, several other jurisdictions, and George have mentioned several other jurisdictions if the world are doing things a bit differently. So China clearly now is the most active in the field. And strangely enough, and paradoxically enough, to some extent, Europe now is more aligned with China than with the US on what to do with the economic policy of big tech. So it's a regulatory innovation, and we will have to assess its effect in some years. Hopefully, if the implementation works well, and with this kind of innovation framework in mind, it will indeed increase the innovation in Europe.
Thank you, Alexander. That's very, very interesting presentation. I guess we need to move now to the people that are potential targets of this, regulation, so we can hear a little bit more about those that will have to live with it. What the opportunities that the DMA presents for them, and also if there are also some risks. So over to you, Daniel.
Thank you very much. And honestly, well, George, first, I hope you're okay, because obviously you had COVID recently, but I hope to see you all in person by the next time. But for me, first of all, it's very humbling to be on a panel with so many people who've actually contributed in many ways, and some quite directly, to having the DMA. Because if I look back and the perceptions at European level and the discussions, this was not a given even a few years ago, and I think it took a lot of work, energy, and effort. I remember 7 years ago starting out at Sky, talking to a digital commissioner about this, and sort of being told it'll never happen, it's impossible. The impact would be negative, and it would just destroy all the good innovation. So I think that Europe has come a long way, our leaders have come a long way, and I also want to say thank you to some of the panelists here. I think we also do owe a debt of gratitude to the people who wrote it, but also to Mr. Schwab in the Parliament, to be honest, because I agree with what Tommaso and Alexandre were saying about it being imperfect, but we also escaped something quite potentially different. A lot of sectors tried to put in sort of almost a catch-all for all the sectoral problems in the DMA. And in the past, a lot of legislation would have gone down that route. So I think this is also a moment to show really where people have been able to come together sort of for hopefully the greater good. And we also saw, interestingly, at different points in the lobbying, and obviously I do think it's relevant for our talk, that some of the targeted platforms try to expand the scope to make it impact many other companies, because that would have actually led to the reinforcement of the status quo. So the outcome is an interesting one, but I'd say as a starting point for what I'm going to say now, quite positive overall. Entry into force likely in early 2023. It's a bit late for some, but again, better than quite often in our process, and for businesses at least you can plan to that, and it's not too quick. But to George's question at the beginning, it is indeed going to be all about how it's implemented. And you're right, for Sky, I guess we're one of the so-called challenger companies, theoretically potentially could benefit. Obviously we're pay TV, we're sports, we're broadcaster, we're streamer, we're an ISP, we're an MVNO, we're news services. We produce our own content with Sky Studios. Now we're making our own television sets with Sky Glass. We're doing a joint venture with NBC Universal and Paramount, launching in basically all of Europe. So, we are indeed hardware, news, broadcasting, internet, mobile. We're a prime example of such a company. But we're still unlikely to become a search engine. And indeed, I think Alexandre's point there about how the market is impacted is relevant, because this shouldn't also suddenly make everyone expect that suddenly, a big company is going to try to directly challenge. You're right, the network effects are just too powerful, I think. Although it'd be interesting to see if anyone does give it a go. And funnily enough, the example on the Telegram is exactly my example. So you see it. So our starting position on this, very briefly, is that indeed a balanced ex-ante framework can bring value to the entire market. It's exactly the kind of early regulatory clarity, frankly, that helped us both in the telecom space and in the content space. So we're hoping that this can now become a race to the top rather than before a race to the bottom. And we do think that it's important to acknowledge that the platform economy was very beneficial. But also, if I recall, Mrs. Vestager many years ago even saying that not all innovation was good. And indeed, we have seen that, and all these companies bought up where competition law simply could not legitimately, in its current form, stop an acquisition that I think no one really thought was for the greater good or for that positive innovation. So for us, if we look at the ex-ante rules now that are on these handful of companies, we think it's a logical approach based on the previous jurisprudence. But we think one of the main things is indeed it'll change and slowly update the bargaining power for companies like ours with them. It won't radically change it from one day to the next, but it will mean that there can no longer simply be a blanket, here's the deal, take it or leave it. And if you have a problem, years down the line, we'll end up in court and we'll figure it out. So it will have an impact on a large variety of digital players who already have to deal regularly on a business level with the platforms. And I think that is indeed a positive one, and it's been touched on by the two previous speakers. The areas that we think are quite useful also for companies, including our own, but I'm trying to really make it a broader point, is indeed the new price transparency rules, possibly some of the audience measurement provisions that will help give more insights into advertising, that will help to start to share some of that information that has been so siloed, and where you actually saw a tendency to try to silo even further until the last moment, and to keep that data as close to the chest as possible. I think another one indeed is going to be the gatekeepers being barred from self-preferencing practices that go beyond ranking, so indexing and crawling, potentially big deal there. We've seen quite a few court cases on this, and also for us as a traditional a non-traditional media player. We think that being able to see a little bit more also where our content is on their other platforms is extremely useful to understand where else we can grow and compete. We do think that the B2C data generated on the platforms will have an impact. We've seen actually that GDPR was used as a reason to share even less data in the past. So having these rules now will slowly, I hope, change the marketing, the negotiating dynamic. And for us, that's an important point because it will change the way we can approach negotiations. But indeed, we have to not get ahead of ourselves. It's not going to help us directly compete in a lot of the fronts. Some of the sectors have been intertwining for many, many years, and it's actually going to be interesting to see now how some of the intertwining services where one of the GAFAM services that looks a lot like one of ours and competes directly against ours, how then that will be addressed, since in many ways they're often still out of the other sectoral regulation. So it's going to be very interesting to see how the very, very big power imbalance that we've seen for many years will start to be addressed. Addressing a little bit the comments of the others, but from a company point of view, indeed, we think it'll be very interesting to see how the new powers are actually used, what kind of people are actually hired, the kinds of legal challenges that are going to be thrown in, because we've seen that the companies that are being targeted here are very good at also targeted legal challenges. So I would just say we don't expect too much right away. We also see a very strong role for national regulators to coordinate very strongly. But when you see what's going on even right now, the case in the news right now that's fascinating is that obviously Apple is getting fined, I think, 5 million euros a week every week in the Netherlands for not complying with mandates on payment methods. Would that be allowed under the DMA? Would they have already had to then solve this? Would they be risking a 10 or 20% fine rather than the 5 million fine? Would that have changed the behavior? That's the kind of thing that we're going to see in the negotiations, but that will also very much depend on obviously the enforcement and the commission that will have this regulator and an enforcer hat for the first time. I'm very curious what frankly all the panelists think of the number of people that are likely to be hired. We had thought that they might increase the number in the final text. Obviously, I haven't seen the final text, but if it's still at 80, that's a very small number for what is being talked about. My other question to the panelists, sorry, George, I feel like with what they've said, I kind of want to, it's to see really how this regulation will interplay with some of the work that's already been happening in member states. Obviously you have strong ex-ante regulation in Germany with the Act Against Restraints of Competition. I know Jeremy can probably talk a lot about it from his point of view. I'm really interested in that. But we hope that this will also create a longer term impact on the wider business community, where regulating this space is no longer seen as strange or unusual, right? Because we've been living in a space where companies like ours are competing directly against a product that can often look very similar, that benefits from all these additional gatekeeper benefits, but that isn't regulated neither in our space or in any. So we really think that this should no longer be seen as anything unusual. My final concluding point here before I stop for now is really just a note of caution, though. We saw an attempt ahead of time to expand the scope into many directions. Obviously, we hope that the new powers will not be expanded on quickly, whether through qualitative designations, delegated acts. We really hope that the first cases and the real work, even the growing pains, can actually be done on the targeted sectors and not on more opportunistic, smaller ones. I think it's really, really important that we see that it can actually work for its intended purpose. And so really to keep it grounded and focused. and not something, with open-ended powers that then could become political. Because for me, one of the great benefits of this from the company perspective is it didn't become too political. It really stayed grounded, linked to the impact assessments, linked to where the market failures and the problems and the imbalances were. And that provides a real opportunity for Europe, for all of us, for the people on this panel to really get into things. And then over time, to really slowly shift that innovation to the most positive possible. And then perhaps you'll see us going into new spaces. The final note of caution is just to say, there is the question of if a company grows too much or wants to acquire something, but then they know they could be designated in a new category. At what point does then that become a disincentive to reach a certain point? And that's something else that I just wanted to float out there because it's an interesting topic as well. So thank you very much, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you for making my job easier in handing over to Jeremy. I think you've heard, Jeremy, the positions of Alexander and Tommaso on kind of the design of the DMA, and then some of the points I guess Daniel raised in terms of the implementation. So I think we're very, very interested to take your view, given your experience, on how you think this is going to be implemented by the Commission and the challenges that they might face. So over to you.
Thanks very much, George. And can I thank the IIC? It's great to, I feel like I've come home to talk to some old friends. I can see some old friends on the participant list. I won't embarrass them by calling out the names. And it's also a pleasure to share such a stage with such a distinguished panel. I might start off, I think, by saying I can see two things that can go wrong in terms of innovation. They are, one is that the enforcement of the DMA won't be good enough. And I think Daniel alluded to it, that you can expect in the early stages, people who are first get ex-ante regulation, they need to be dragged kicking and screaming into compliance, and there's a big incentive to use legal battles and to delay delay the implementation or to minimize the impact that the regulation has, and that obviously is something that can have an impact on the ability for third-party innovation, as Alexandra and Tommaso were talking about. And then the other danger, which I'm sure we will hear a lot about, is is having a chilling effect on innovation by the gatekeepers themselves, and that's a real. I have to say that is a real issue, and even things like when we talk about interoperability, the implementation of interoperability, I think the audience from the telecom sector will know that's actually a really difficult thing to do, and it of course means that not only does it take a long time, it can force people into it limits the scope for innovation to some extent. So what can be done about these things? I think one interesting difference, as moving from the ex-ante field to the competition field, one interesting difference has really come home to me is that in the competition field, a lot develops through case law. It's through cases and how cases are decided. Whereas in the ex-ante regulation field, a lot gets developed through further specifying obligations, modifying obligations, issuing guidelines. So you kind of head off in advance. So this will be a very interesting change of approach for DG Comp to start using some more of those tools of ex-ante regulation that they haven't been using, or haven't had cause to use in the competition field. And I think, George, you asked me to talk about some of about the experience of telecoms regulation. I'll maybe lace that through my remarks here. I think those are very useful ways, and they are quicker, and of course, I mean, you certainly saw in the early days of telecoms regulation how difficult it was to get the incumbents to open up, and it probably took 10 years of tweaking of regulatory requirements before the regime became really that effective, and so this is a much less detailed regime. So, but in some ways, making people fear the penalties is going to be very important at first. But the other thing I would say just about guidelines, I was going to just, people will remember the open internet and the net neutrality regulation, which in some ways has some parallels with the DMA, in that the objective is to stop people with market power from using that market power to prevent third parties from having access, so that they can innovate. But there was a debate a few years ago about the impact of the net neutrality regulation might have on the use of 5G and network slicing, and that was in a way, nobody intended that it should have that effect. The regulators said it won't have that effect. The industry said we fear it will. And I remember having to do quite a lot of work with the industry to get them to articulate why they had that fear. And it turned out, I think, that they had the fear was real, even if it wasn't necessarily well founded. And it was possible to tweak the guidelines so that the fear then disappeared. So that will be something I think to watch out for, is that kind of dynamic. You asked me about the skills and competencies, and Daniel talked about 80 people. I gather it is now rather more than 80 people. Certainly, when I read the original legislative proposal, that was the thing I liked least about it, was that it was clearly not enough people. In Ireland, we have the best part of 170 people just regulating aircom, and so if you're taking half a dozen or 8 big platforms, that's a big deal. But I think also the question about the sort of people you have. Again, in a competition authority, you have lawyers, you have economists, and you have investigators, largely. But in an ex-ante regulator, you will have engineers, you will have accountants, you'll have policy people as well. And one of the tricks in ex-ante regulation is being able to integrate those skills. So understand, so you will need to do this well. You will need to have data scientists, or not to who understand. Well, you need to have people who understand what data scientists do. You'll need to have people who understand what AI is and what it can do. You'll need to have people who understand how data can be used in different commercial ways. That's you'll have to pay those people very well, and so it will be a big difference in the nature of the people will be needed. And it does actually, it's slightly off the topic. It will be hard to build up that competence. And that capability. And in some ways, it will be a bit of a waste if it's only used for DMA regulation. I think one of my experiences of when you have specialist industry regulators, there's a lot to be said for giving them a broader regulatory remit in relation to the industry they're regulating. Because once they've built up that expertise, so at some point, who's going to do consumer protection regulation of the platforms? Who's going to do GDPR regulation of the platforms? Who's going to do DSA regulation of the platforms? If you've got the expertise to do the DMA regulation, you will be the best placed institution to effectively do that other kind of regulation. So I don't believe the institutional setup we have here is the final word, I would say, but on the other hand, there's a lot to be said for running before you could walk. So I wouldn't criticize what's in the DMA now. And the last thing you asked me to talk about was the role of national competition authorities, which Daniel also talked about. So I think CCPC, we have a very strong point of view that this is actually a pan-European deal. It makes a huge amount of sense for a DG Comp or at least a kind of a pan-European agency or body to have the role, but I think there's an interesting dynamic goes on between national regulators and pan-European regulators, which is the national regulators are closer to the markets often, and the dynamic you get is that things often start in national markets. So Daniel, you talked about the Apple fine in the Netherlands. We saw the Bundeskartell agency taking the case against Facebook on data sharing between the platforms. In the telecoms field, again, going back to net neutrality, I think it was the Netherlands had a net neutrality law before there was a pan-European net neutrality law. So quite often you find things start locally and then they get attention in the pan-European space, and that is a dynamic that is really worth preserving. So when I look at the DMA, the ability for national competition authorities to do pre-investigations under the DMA is I think could be quite good, because some of the behaviours that are in breach may turn, the first person to complain about it might be, an Irish. There's an Irish platform called Done Deal, which is kind of a list, listings. If they're getting trampled all over by one of the gatekeepers, or want access to the gatekeepers in order to expand their business and can't, it may well be that you end up with a pre-investigation in Ireland and 4 pre-investigations in other member states that are looking at the same behaviour, and then that comes to the attention of DG Comp. I think that will be quite a good dynamic. And then I think there's also some issues around mergers, where the mergers get notified or informed to the Commission, and the Commission can then inform national competition authorities, and it may be that the merger isn't notifiable under the merger regulation, but can may have a national competition implication. So, for example, in Ireland, we're changing our merger. One of the things we're changing about our merger law at the moment is to give the CCPC effectively an ability to call in any merger. So if we find out about it, even if it's not notifiable, it doesn't meet our mandatory notification criteria, we can still say we think this has got a competition angle and call it in and assess it as if it was notifiable. So I'm quite optimistic actually about the way in which NCAs and DG Comp can interact here. I think the way it's been set up in the DMA does create a lot of good possibilities. And I will stop talking so that there can be at least some time for questions.
Great, thank you, Jeremy, very much. So, and thanks to all the speakers. I think maybe I can start with a couple of open questions for the panel, and I would also obviously invite you, if you heard anything that you wanted to comment from the other panel speakers, then please feel free to do so. Just starting a little bit on this comparison with telecom, which I think is an interesting one. I mean, one of the things we know about telecoms is generally the business model in telecoms is pretty similar everywhere in terms of opening up. You have a network, and then you open up those networks, try and offer telephone initially, and then broadband services, and that has been the kind of the evolution of the sector over the years. And in some sense, a sign of success, if you want, in terms of the regime, was that, I remember the days back in 2003 when there were 18 markets that would be susceptible to ex-ante regulation in telecoms, and this has come down over time as more and more of the supply chain was kind of opened up. Now, if I look at the DMA and I look at the services that the DMA is going to be regulating, I mean, it's a much more varied group of business models. I know we're focusing very much on Google and Facebook, and it's the advertising business model, but there are also other models, and there are also other market structures in terms of the different core platform services. What would you think? And I know it might be a little of a speculation, but how do you think success would be judged of the DMA? Especially when we have the telecoms kind of precedent, what do we think in 5 or 10 years would happen, which would allow us to say, yes, that has been successful, or that there are things that could be improved or changed?
So maybe I start first, also because I have a train to catch in about 20 minutes. So, well, the success will be judged vis-a-vis the 2 main objectives, which is contestability and fairness. So de facto, people will be looking at market shares and at metrics as imperfect as they might be, but we'll be looking at those. So if 5-10 years from now we don't have an ecosystem which has a wider set of participants, we will have failed. If instead it will increase. So this is a point that in competition policy people are struggling to accept, that they want to defend, the consumer surplus as if competitors didn't matter and we shouldn't defend competitors of incumbents. But ultimately, we have learned that without competitors, you don't have any competition. So we'll be looking at that. So we'll be looking at alternatives. We'll be looking at choice, at more variety. A couple of comments to make to the previous speakers. I think we are all of us in agreement, so there is nothing we can disagree with. But perhaps a slightly different take to Jeremy. My fear of what may go wrong is that the process is enforced by the same type of people who failed with antitrust regulation. So DG Comp, to which I belong, in a sense, I was a chief economist there, we failed with antitrust enforcement. You don't want to put people like me to do this kind of regulation since we lost it in the past. So you really need different type. You don't need lawyers. Perhaps you don't need many economists. I'm sorry, George, you really need the computer scientists. You really need a new breed of people that understand that. So it will be very technical, it will take time. You need that. I also agree that institutional learning, we like competition, even when it comes to among regulators. So we have to start doing things. So yes, it's a global problem, and obviously Europe has a lead, and the discussion which is happening, which is a positive one. So multilateralism is back on the table with Biden, etc. That's good. But the more we start doing things at the local level, the more we learn, as we did in telecoms. There are some regulators that started up first, and they led the pack, and these also may relax the resource constraints. Okay, if part of the job is done locally, you don't need the European Commission to do all of it. The last thing, back to the innovation thing, which is obviously a very important one. Very quickly, I want to say, first, sometimes we have to be more precise of what we mean by innovations. It cannot be a catch-all phrase for anything. So there is innovation which creates value. That's what we want. But there's also innovation which is just extracting value. So if the innovation makes Google even better at targeting advertising to get a higher surplus, which is being extracted from a small firm which is stuck with the Google ecosystem, so that hasn't created any surplus to society, only profits to Google. And there's also innovation which is destroying value. We shouldn't forget, it's back to the business model. Some of these business models are based on externalities which have negative effect. So there is research, very serious research coming from Stanford University and Microsoft Labs, which is showing that a third of the time we spend on Facebook, for instance, it's time we regret about. So if innovation is done to keep us inside an ecosystem, it's impossible to get out because they call it engagement. Some of the people call it addiction. This is not the type of innovation that we want to promote. So innovation, we need to qualify a little bit what we mean. The huge opportunity now with the DMA is that, and I hope people like Daniel, etc., they say we don't want to become a search engine, perhaps, but I would like to see companies like Sky to change the direction and the ambition of innovation. Before, they wouldn't even think about it. Okay, but now this is a possibility. So to me, this is the way forward. And if we can affect, of course, the state is not going to tell you what you can innovate on, but it's offering a greater set of experimentation, which wasn't possible before, and now it becomes a real possibility.
Thank you, Tommaso. And I think if you feel at some point you have to run, then feel free to run. Alexander, maybe you have some observations on that from your side?
Yes, on the question of staff, because of course the quality of enforcement will depend on that. So I mean, several things have been said. The 80 people which was envisaged at the beginning may be based on a misunderstanding of what the DMA should be, because I think some people have the idea that the DMA is just a speedy antitrust, and we will continue with a kind of hit and run strategy from the agencies. You intervene when there is a problem, and then you leave the market alone. I don't think that the DMA will lead to that. It will more lead to a kind of traditional, let's say, a regulation, and possibly evolve like a big bank regulation with a constant and deep oversight of the firm. So, I think the 80 people came from a kind of a misunderstanding of what the DMA is. It is not antitrust, it is regulation. And this is why I'm not sure that it should be DG Comp alone enforcing that for different reasons, the reason that Tommaso mentioned, but I think because it's a different legal instrument. Of course, the composition of the staff matters more than the size. So clearly, we would need data scientists and computer scientists, we really need a geek culture within the Commission and not anymore a bureaucratic culture. I think it will be extremely difficult, much more difficult than to adopt the DMA, of having a kind of a change in culture within the Commission. And we will see, but I mean, those kind of corporate culture, to change the corporate culture of a big institution like the Commission is quite a challenge. And also within the company themselves, because, you know, we have to understand that most of those companies have not been regulated for a number of years. So for them also, it will be a huge cultural shift to go into compliance. And I think for me, that's where I see the most challenge, you know, in how you change the culture of the Commission and the culture of the regulator. I fully agree with Jeremy that there is a lot of synergies to be done between the instrument, DMA, DSA, and everything. And I'm a little bit worried that there is no legal provision which will allow the transmission of confidential information from one legal act to another legal act. So I'm not sure how it will play out there. And then a last element regarding staff. There is one thing I like a lot in banking supervision, which is the other example where you have a European regulatory authority, which is the ECB in this case, is they have set up joint investigation team with the ECB. So you have, for every big bank, you have a joint investigation team composed of the national financial supervision supervisor and the ECB. And I think that's a model we could think of when we implement the DMA, to take the local element expertise and experience that the national authority have. Another point on the use of guidelines that also Jeremy mentioned, and there I think it's a strategic decision that the Commission will have to make very soon. You know, whether they want to adopt guidelines at the very beginning of the enforcement to give some indication, and I tend to agree with Jeremy that's maybe the possibility, or whether they will wait to have a sufficient number of cases to then adopt the guidelines, which is more the culture in competition law, because we have also some guidelines in competition law, but they tend to be exposed, if you want to, they tend to be based on existing cases, where indeed in antitrust, in regulation, they tend to be more ex ante before any case. So I think here again, because it's a regulatory instrument, guidelines from the very beginning would be welcome, but I'm not sure that that will be the decision that would be taken. And finally, on the success of the DMA, I think it's not necessarily whether the market share of some company have decreased or increased, but it's whether indeed we have seen new players coming and maybe disrupting. That would be, of course, the best result. But we should also not overestimate, I think, the influence of regulation on market structure and innovation. It has a role, of course, it has an important role, but we have many other factors which will play there. So, I mean, of course, we are a regulatory community, so we tend to think that regulation is everything. But I mean, there is a lot of major element which also will be important there.
Thanks, Alexander. I'm not sure if Daniel and Jeremy, do you have any observations other than what you've heard or on this issue of what success looks like?
Yeah, I mean, I think Alexandre's point about changing the culture of the companies that for the first time need to deal with this is probably the most impactful. And even if they don't get direct challengers, if that actually changes, you will see a ripple effect throughout the entire industry as negotiations, deals, partnerships then change to something hopefully a little bit more partnership focused. You know, it's an opportunity for them too to use this as a badge of trust to grow in a positive way. You know, yes, are we going to be going into some of the tangential markets, perhaps competing on some things? Yeah, I hope so. You know, we have some ideas, but again, this is not suddenly going to enable us from one day to another, you know, to grow 10 times in a year by taking on, you know, the biggest immediately. That's just not how obviously business works. So it's just about also being realistic. There's no company in the space that isn't already massive to be included in the scope that could seize on this. It's more the other way, where their behavior can then hopefully now lead to other companies being able to be empowered more, where previously, you were stuck with a one size fits all, sign this, or we're not interested, and that can actually have a really big effect. I'm really interested by Alexandre's point about the commission mentality and how it changes, whether they hire more people like Tommaso or if they go back in a different direction, I think. And I think you're right. My gut feeling actually told me to expect guidelines much sooner. So it'll be interesting to see what they do, if it's more the old commission regulatory model or the comp model that starts to shape this more. And I think based on what you see there, you'll probably get a good idea of how they're putting the rest together, if you're reading the tea leaves like we all try to.
George, I'll just make a couple of comments. I mean, it's a very boring panel because we all agree with each other, I'm afraid. But just two things about success. So absolutely, I think it's driven. It's whether or not we really do see fairness and openness. One indicator of success would be if the gatekeepers' own business processes and innovation processes include fairness and openness by design. Just as they have security by design or privacy by design, it's baked into the way they do things. If we have fairness and openness, I'm agnostic whether if Google's innovation wipes the floor with skies or vice versa. That's the market. It's not who wins. It's whether Sky has an opportunity to compete. Is my thing, and so we won't necessarily be able to judge it by whether Sky has won. We'll be able to judge it by whether Sky had an opportunity. So I think the implementation within the gatekeepers is absolutely crucial for that. And I thought, Alexandra, you made a fantastic point about the culture. And I think that is absolutely right. I have a modest proposal, which is that the DMA unit should be based in Dublin. It's a lovely city. It's close to where a lot of the gatekeepers have their European headquarters. And if it gets out of Brussels and is based in Dublin, I'm sure it will be able to have a very we have plenty of geek culture for them to feed on here.
Thank you, Jeremy. I'm not sure I agree with everything that has been said, but I think I have to stay in my moderator role, Jeremy. But there'll be plenty of opportunities to discuss, I'm sure. I think maybe one last question, which is again a little bit the parallel with the telecoms framework, is that there are different, as I mentioned, different business models in when we look at gatekeepers. As I say, I know we're focusing a lot on Google and Facebook, but there are different activities by the other gatekeepers, and often they would be facing more competition than others. A reminder that the market share threshold is 45 million users. I'm not sure if that will change in the final text, but 45 million users in a continent with 400 million is very far from 40%. So the question is, the obligations which are being proposed are pretty common. And there's a set of obligations that is everybody has to implement, and then there's some room for the obligations under Article 6 to be modified. And I don't want to get too technical, but I also noticed, Tomas, in the paper that I think was produced by your group of experts, you made the suggestion that there should be, in relation to the obligations which are more flexible, where there is some room for tailoring them, that there should be what you call an efficiency defense. So the gatekeepers could come in and try and argue that there are reasons why that obligation would be disproportionate if it was imposed on them. So my question is a little bit on the implementation phase. Given there are so many different business models and the market structures in the different core platform services differ, it's not like the telecoms network. Should there be flexibility in how these obligations are interpreted, and how do you see that panning out in practice?
In just a second, because I'm already wearing my jacket to go to the railway station, and Alexander, I'm sure he will give you the right answer. I just want to say, George, that looking for the perfect system now would be just another opportunity to delay something which is very urgent. Also, yes, there are different business models. Some are advertising based, some are still selling stuff, but there is also analogies. So, for instance, Amazon self-preferences and Google self-preferencing and Apple self-preferences, different business models but similar economics. So there are commonalities. And the last point is, honestly, these are the largest almighty firms on earth. I'm sure they can defend themselves. I'm sure they can be heard. And the alternative of waiting another 10 years, as I said, it's something that we don't have that luxury any longer. So to me also, the prospect of having perhaps a little bit of adjacent competition between Facebook and Amazon, on Amazon who's entering the advertising space. I mean, going forward as a European citizen, it's not a good scenario. So either we are dominated by current 4 or 5 monopolies in their own core areas, or we may have those 3, 4, 5 firms which are a little bit having a cozy competition among each other. This is not the disruptive innovation of a digital future where we have something new. So it's the same guys, the same ideas. So we need. So yes, it's new. It's perhaps draconian, imperfect, but we need to break a few things. And I think the suggestion that we have so far and implementation, we'll see. We don't even have the text, so we haven't even read the text yet. But this is I want to finish on the upbeat. This is exactly the direction we need. We will hear a lot about the problems. We already hear a lot about the problems, but it's a gigantic, colossal opportunity for Europe, which is a good thing. So we have to cherish it, and we have to congratulate with all the buts and ifs, etc. The European Commission for having that, and the European Parliament, because a lot has come also from Andreas Schwab, as it was said. The big miss, people who know me, is that we are doing nothing with mergers. That's a big miss, but nothing is perfect.
Thank you, Tommaso. Do you want to offer any comments, Alexander? Sorry, Daniel or Jeremy?
Just to say that there are some flexibility in the system, so we should not overestimate the difference between the CMA system and the European system, because some obligations are clearly business model focused. Half of them, in fact, are business model focused. So the other half are general. And then the flexibility will be in the interpretation, because as I said before, I mean, nothing is self-executing. So we will have a huge battle of interpretation. And I think that's where the flexibility, you have some flexibility in the system. Last thing, I don't think we need, given the objective of the text, an efficiency defense. What we need is a kind of contestability or fairness defense, but not an efficiency defense. I mean, I don't think that given the objective of the text, that should be the right defense to organize in the interpretation. But I think it would be, as Jeremy again was saying, referring to the net neutrality guidelines, this dialogue that the Commission will have to have with the gatekeeper is absolutely key. And I hope that both of them will be engaging, the gatekeeper and the Commission, and not too much adversarial. And I guess some platform will be more adversarial than others.
We all live in hope, Alexander. And anyone else with other comments?
I mean, I just think it'll be interesting to see then ultimately which model and approach can work better, whether it's the UK one or the European one, and if they can actually learn from each other or work together to address things together. Because I think it's an interesting one right here in Europe now. We have these two different approaches trying to solve the same thing. I think both will inspire others. I think it's a great opportunity to really learn what works, and this is just the first step, right? I think that's the key point. This is just the first step. So we'll be able to learn, adapt, grow, and improve based on what we see in the next few years.
Right. I think we are. Sorry, go ahead, Jeremy.
So, Josh, I just wanted to say, I mean, you talked a lot about telecoms regulation. I just wanted to point out the limits of the analogy as well. We talked a lot about where the analogy is, but innovation in telecoms is slow. It takes a long time to go from 4G to 5G. You see that coming years in advance, and the regulatory processes are also slow, but they reflect that. We're talking here about something where the pace of change is much, much faster, so having obligations that are set at the kind of rather higher level and more generic that we have in the DMA is much more appropriate. And I think it absolutely underlines Alexandra's point about the need for dialogue between the regulator and the regulated entities to make sure that that the way the obligations are interpreted fit the the reality of this fast-changing environment. Sorry, that's all I'll say.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jeremy, and let me thank everybody for participating in what I think was a very interesting session on a topic which is a little bit unusual. And I would totally agree, Jeremy, on the limits of comparing with telecoms. I think that's very appropriate. But I also feel that there are some lessons to be learned, especially in the implementation phase. Because when it comes to the point that Alexander made about how much the companies that will be subject might challenge, and how you respond to those challenges, I think those sort of issues can be common between the different sectors. So my feeling is that this won't be the last time we talk about this, and I thank you again very much for taking the time to participate. Thanks for the audience, and then I'll hand back to Lynn for some closing remarks.